We are live.
Can I go? Can I start?
Yes, please.
Good evening. Welcome to this webinar on the topic critical thinking from NEP to student learning. To discuss this, we have with us three very experienced educators. They're all irritatingly modest, won't say anything about themselves if left to them. So let me introduce them to you. Subir Shukla is with Group IGNIS. He has made significant contributions in the education space within India and globally, across countries in Asia and Africa, focusing on the needs of marginalized children. He was chief consultant to the Ministry of Education, as it is now called, and later advisor for the development of quality framework for the Right to Education Act. He's currently a member of the team of experts tasked by the government's think tank NITI Aayog to develop India's vision for school education. Subir also recently co-authored a book titled Child Development and Education in the 21st Century. Tara Mohanan, a co-founder of Think, is respected internationally for her work in many areas of theoretical linguistics. She has a PhD in linguistics from Stanford University. She taught at National University of Singapore for 16 years. She has a rare range in educational capabilities. She experiments with inquiry-oriented activities for second grade children. We are talking about 7-year-olds. She is also an advisor to PhD scholars on doctoral dissertations. KP Mohanan is a co-founder of Think, taught at the University of Texas at Austin, at MIT, Stanford, and at the National University of Singapore, and most recently at IISER Pune. He has made significant contributions to linguistic theory. With Tara, he co-designed an inquiry-oriented undergraduate program in linguistics at NUS. He has worked extensively with the nature of academic knowledge and inquiry against the backdrop of human beliefs. More generally, as we call him, we generally loves to reason, except when asserting that he is the best cook in the world. Well, as for me, like James Bond, I should introduce myself as I am Sriram, Lucky Sriram, because I work with all of them and I'm constantly learning from all of them. And nothing better can happen to anyone in the education space, I think. An announcement before we begin the discussion. If you have questions, and we encourage you to have questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Type your questions in the chat box. If you want your question to be responded to by a particular panelist, mention the name. Rashmi and Aditi, my colleagues, will be monitoring the chat box and curating the questions. So with that, introductions are out of the way, and let's move into the discussion. Well, the National Education Policy has been the flavor of the month of August. It was released around the last day of July. And since then, we have had lots of stuff written on it in print media and spoken on videos and in social networks. However, the views of our panelists will be valuable for us to mull over. So let's begin with the question, what are the 2 or 3 takeaways for you from the NEP? I will begin with Tara first. Over to Tara.
Tara, you're muted.
Okay, sorry about that. Hello, everyone. Now, before getting into the discussion, given that critical thinking is a central theme today, Sriram, may I clarify something?
Yes.
Okay, this has to do with 2 terms. The terms are skeptical and critical that are used very differently in everyday language and in the context of education research, let's say the academic language. In everyday language, when someone says, I'm skeptical of such and such, what it means is, I don't believe it, I reject it. But in the academic context, to be skeptical is to say, I will accept neither that something is true, know that it is false without proof or evidence for it. So suppose someone says homeopathy is effective, or they say homeopathy is not effective. I'm just taking an example. I would accept neither of those statements as a skeptical person. I would treat both in exactly the same way until there are convincing reasons to believe one way or the other. Okay, so that's for skeptical. Similarly, in ordinary language, when someone says, I'm critical of that idea, there is an implication of being negatively disposed towards the idea, of criticizing or critiquing it. But in the academic context, critical thinking, which is what we're going to talk about, involves evaluating something by thinking clearly and rationally through it and arriving at one's own judgment or one's own decision if it requires action. Okay, so this was just to clarify the terms for the rest of the session. Now, going back to your question about important takeaways from the NEP document. There are several, but the takeaways that I will focus on here have to do primarily with the purpose of education, the statement of the purpose of education. So let me quote the statement of the purpose of education in NEP, in the NEP document. Aditi, could you share that? I'll read it out. Yeah. So the purpose of education, of the education system, is to develop good human beings capable of rational thought and action, possessing compassion and empathy, courage and resilience, scientific temper and creative imagination, with sound ethical moorings and values. Now, this was why this was important for me is because of how close it is to our vision of education in Think. So let me quote the essentials of Think's statement. I'll leave out the details. Think views education as preparing us for, this is at the end, preparing us for a life of intellectual engagement, compassionate action, and responsible functioning as global citizens. Now, I found the NEP statement exciting because there was so much of an overlap between the vision in it and Think's vision of education. So that was one takeaway. Now, the other, the specifics that I take away are two crucial clusters in education, that shape a person. One is the intellectual cluster, and the other is the ethical cluster. So the ethical cluster surrounds the expression good human being in the statement, which is expanded as possessing compassion and empathy, courage and resilience, and so on, right? Now, the intellectual cluster is something that pervades everything in education, from the design of curriculum and teaching learning materials to assessment. And this is the scientific temper. And what that includes is creative imagination on the one hand and rational thought and action on the other. And these are brought together. So these are brought together under the scientific temper. So those are the three things that I picked out from the document as being important. There are, as I said, other things as well. Now, challenges in achieving these goals, there are many, but I won't say anything about them at this point. I leave them to emerge in the course of the discussion as we go along. Okay.
All right. Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. Subir, what would be your takeaways? You have to unmute yourself.
Right. So I have takeaways which are first in the form of some of the principles that are articulated, and secondly in the form of some of the initiatives that are advocated. In terms of the principles, to me, the biggest issue in achieving educational quality has been the entire lack of equity and the fact that those who are marginalized in society continue to remain marginalized in education, even though education is essentially supposed to bridge the gap. So I think the focus on the marginalized, disadvantaged, and underrepresented groups is critical. And therefore, one corollary of this is that you need to have diversity, because the moment you have uniformity, then a lot of participants are going to be left out. That is reflected to some extent in suggesting flexibility and learner choice. And also on this, though I'm not sure, but I think it's an important statement on trying to remove boundaries between subject disciplines as they have existed till now. So I put them together as part of the issue of flexibility. And also at least an overt statement on higher education, higher order aspects. Now, this is important because in our country, there's been such a lot of thrust on getting the basics across. There are surveys to look at whether children can do basic things, that the higher order part is neglected, and therefore the basic also is not attained. So in terms of principles, I would say these three are critical principles. And in terms of initiatives, I think, the overall emphasis on early years is important, because the kind of gaps that spring at an early age are very difficult to recover for the rest of a child's time in school. They remain for life, essentially. The second is the thrust on teacher management, professional development. Again, this has been existing for some time, but trying to make it a little more professional, more organized. I think that's important. And this is also connected with the third part of this, which is for the first time, we are overtly talking about standards, especially standards of performance. They have been existing from 2006 onwards, but to put it in policy framework is important. Again, none of this is going to be easy to implement or develop, but that's what a policy is for. It's meant to state aspirational things, and I think these are worthwhile aspirations to work towards. So to me, these are the bigger takeaways, and of course, we'll discuss the challenges and the rest further on.
Thank you, Subir. Over to Mohanan.
Okay, I think I will focus on the aims with respect to what the learners learn out of the educational system. And for that, I would like to quote a sentence from the policy. Aditi?
Yeah, give me 1 second.
Okay, this is from page 4 of the document. I'll read it out. Education must develop not only cognitive capacities, both the foundational capacities of literacy and numeracy, and higher order cognitive capacities such as critical thinking and problem solving, but also social, ethical, and emotional capacities and dispositions. The way I see it, the emphasis here is on one is cognitive capacities, both the lower order cognitive capacities such as literacy and numeracy, and the higher order cognitive capacities such as critical thinking and problem solving. And one could add such things as inquiry and perhaps design thinking, integration, and so on, many other things of the higher order cognition. So there is a shift from knowledge to cognition, cognition meaning ways of knowing. And that's important. And the other important aspect of this is the emphasis on the social, ethical, and emotional capacities and dispositions. And I think dispositions are also important. And this is where the scientific temper, which is a disposition, and that can be enlarged as rational temper. So for me, if this sentence, the meaning of the sentence is fully understood, and we have ways of actually pursuing this in terms of the syllabus, the learning materials, and assessment, and also teacher education and classroom activities. If you can implement all those along all these dimensions, not just the classroom stuff, but also syllabus, learning materials, and assessment. Assessment is crucial. Then I think we have a way of transforming what students learn in an incredible way. And I would also like to add the third piece, which is the PM saying, not teaching, not telling students what to think, but helping them to develop the ability to think. How to think is more important than what to think. And this comes in exactly in parallel with the higher order cognitive capacities. And I would like to focus on that aspect, the how to think. So I would like to say that combined with higher order capacities would mean how to think like a mathematician, how to think like a scientist, how to think like a philosopher, how to think like a historian, and so on. These are some of the higher order capacities that we should expect from students, especially at the level of secondary students and tertiary students. And if you can do that, then our education will be incredible. But as I said, again, we should begin with syllabus design very carefully. If the syllabus doesn't specify what the higher order thinking capacities are, that's not going to happen. If the learning materials, textbooks, and so on do not reflect higher order thinking capacities, nothing will happen. And finally, this is probably the most important. If the assessment does not test higher order thinking capacity, they continue to test information, acquisition of information, and mechanical skills, extremely low order, we may not be able to achieve. No matter what we do, what students learn will still be exactly the same. I think that would be roughly my take on what we have to get from NEP 2020.
All right. So that is quite sort of large content for us to mull over. If we have to zero in on critical thinking, which has acquired a certain centrality in the policy making sort of process now, as you mentioned, Mohan, we now have Prime Minister saying that the focus is now on how to think and not on what to think as it was before. And he also made another statement saying that India is shifting from the burden of the school back to critical thinking. So critical thinking seems to have acquired a certain importance. Having said that, the document obviously doesn't really clarify what critical thinking is or what they mean by critical thinking. We have popular terms used among educators for critical thinking. Is that anything which is not rote learning is taken to be critical thinking? So you have problem-based learning, you have project-based learning, you have experiential learning, hands-on learning, and so on. So I would like to ask Tara, is critical thinking all of this, or is it different from all of this?
All right. So the various terms you mentioned, Sriram, the different kinds of learning, project-based, what was that, problem-based, experiential learning, hands-on learning, and so on. Now, these are popular among educators because though they are stated in terms of learning appears in the term, they're actually more like pedagogies that a teacher can use effectively in the classroom. Okay, it's a means of facilitating learning. What makes critical thinking different is that, as the NEP document says and has come up earlier with what Mohan said, critical thinking is a higher order cognitive ability. And higher order cognitive abilities are, in fact, inquiry abilities. Now, with regard to critical thinking, I'd like to tell a story. Okay, this is about a friend of ours. He was 6 years old at the time of the story, and now is a physics professor in Switzerland. One day we saw him by the roadside doing something strange. This was a 6-year-old kid, okay? He was looking at the ground intently, and every now and then he would jump up and land on the ground. Just one jump. After he had done this a few times, we went up to him and asked him what he was doing. And he said that his teacher had told him that day that the earth spins, that the earth moves. And then he said, but it doesn't. So, because if the earth were really spinning, then if he jumped high enough and came down, he would land in a place, in a spot that was different from where he lifted off, but he was coming down on the same spot. So it couldn't be the case that the earth was moving. All right. So this was his way of figuring out what the teacher was saying. And there are three parts here, three parts to this. There is the what, the why, and the how. The what, of course, is what the teacher told him. And he heard it, and immediately his question was, is that true? And the why was what this boy was raising. What are the reasons for believing that the earth spins or moves? And that why is the critical thinking. And then his question was, how do I find out? He figured out a way of finding out. He was jumping to find out. And what he was doing there was he was inquiring. He was trying to arrive at an answer. He was looking for reasons for why the teacher said what she said. Okay, so there are these three components to at least in this example. The structure of critical thinking and inquiry may not be this in every case, but roughly this. So this is why critical thinking then is asking the question, why should I believe such and such? Yeah, that's.
Thank you, Sarah. Now over to Subir. I would like to ask you a question. This is a territory you are extremely familiar with. Policy planners may be committed to critical thinking, but do we need a commitment from the entire educational hierarchy so that it actually leads to student learning? In the sense that does critical thinking call for, or doesn't it call for a radical transformation of mindsets across the hierarchy from the minister to the teacher? Or can it be achieved through, that is a humongous task, right? Now, can it be achieved through changes in curriculum, textbooks, etc., asking the students and the teachers and administrators to be executors of a curriculum which has a lot of critical thinking content in that? What has been your experience, and what would you think is feasible?
One of the things is that virtually any idea that we can think of has been tried out at some point or the other in the last 30 years in some place or the other in India. And what that experience tells us is that the notion that by changing some fundamental components, change will actually come about, including changing assessment. That notion is limited in many ways. Just like, we say a spring has a metal memory, system, society, people, there's a certain kind of way of working that they keep springing back to. There's a kind of default mean that operates. And that is because, something is in our blood. It is also part of the power structure that we inhabit. So, within families, the big virtue is listen to your elders. Within schools, obedience, we are all taught, no, yours obediently is what we have to write. We have a school system which functions on basis of a command and control setup. What goes down the line is instructions, whatever the policy might be, but what does the teacher get? A set of instructions to be followed exactly as given. And in all of this, what happens is who benefits? It's essentially, it goes on reinforcing whoever is in any position of power. So as is repeatedly said, that nobody, no one's going to give you the education that you need to overthrow them. So there are things which people might like to say, and these things have to be said because, we are making a transition from what we used to be, which I will call an information scarce mindset. See, 70 years ago, 50 years ago, if you had a lot of information or knowledge, you were knowledgeable, you knew something. Now, with a mobile device, you can get all this information anyway. So, when you had that kind of situation, the person who had the information would give it to you in exchange for something. It was different kinds of forms of rent seeking in whatever way you like to see. Now you can't do that anymore, which is the reason why our policy and everybody else is compelled to keep talking about learning how to learn, to do critical thinking. But saying that is one thing and making it happen is another thing. How do you make it happen in a classroom where, in order to get children to think, a teacher has to give up that position of privilege and power? How do you make it happen in a situation where trainers, administrators have to do something which renders their statements, like Tara was mentioning, questionable by teachers? So, if in a meeting a teacher stands up and tells his superior officer, I mean, that word is bad, but that's the term that is used, that, sir, what you are saying has been said before, and the evidence is that this does not work, everything will fall apart. So really speaking, I am of the confirmed opinion, and I have the evidence I will quote is that much of what we talk about in terms of critical thinking has been incorporated in things like curriculum and textbook and assessment at different points in different places. Yet, a few years later, things are back to what they used to be. And the reason is that we are not looking at a few things. One, we are not looking at, we are looking at how children learn, but we are not looking at how teachers learn, how systems learn to become different. What are the incentives for systems to change? What is the sequence in which they change? What are the triggers for a system to change? How can a system be supported to make a change over a long enough period for this to come about? These are things we need to look at. So we do not look at the entire ecosystem of it. We do not look at the the meta picture in terms of the power structures that operate within society, that operate within a system. So, what I feel is that the notion that changing what we may call the core components, which include curriculum, pedagogy, materials, and assessment, classroom organization, school management. These are what I call core, mainly because they operate directly inside the classroom, is insufficient unless you work on the enabling components which are outside the classroom, which include teacher recruitment, transfer, posting, teacher deployment, teacher training, professional development, assessment of performance, protocols, administration, the rest of it, research, policy, legislation. There are several things that go together. So really speaking, the challenge is much bigger. I know at least that from 1980s onwards, organizations have been making different kinds of curricula, pedagogies, components, materials, whatever. And even within programs like DPEP, a lot of things were done. But repeatedly, what it runs aground is that the moment things start working, the moment children start asking questions, the moment teachers start asking questions, the empire strikes back. What we have not learned is how to deal with that.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Subir. I think we will come back to you on this empire striking back. To Mohanan, I will ask rather philosophical, for the lack of a better word. Should critical reading focus on children or students acquiring a certain competency, or should it have a purpose, in the sense that can we create a curriculum of critical thinking which is a standalone curriculum till students participate, and then what they do with that, what social practices they deploy this critical thinking for, it's not the concern of the education system? Or should the critical thinking aspect or curriculum or component have a purpose towards, say, for example, a just society or removal of inequalities or overall well-being of of human beings or living things, etc. And so, in how will you juggle this? What would you prefer between the two options?
Sriram, actually, I would like to pick up on what Subir said about the Empire Strikes Back idea. And the essence of what he was saying is that we are actually, education is in a larger context, a cultural context of total obedience and uncritical acceptance of what the authority says. And if a student disobeys or questions what the authority says, the empire will strike back. And this is related to the question that you're asking. Given that overall culture, what do we do? Is the question that Subir was asking. And he was also pointing out something that I would like to phrase as the problem of complex adaptive systems. Complex adaptive systems have the following property. If you try to make a change, it will turn around and do exactly the same thing from a different route. It's like saying if you put a rock in the middle of a river, the river will continue flowing in the, ultimately in the same direction, but it will go around that rock. This is a characteristic of complex adaptive systems. But if you change some of the trigger points, then there will be a transformation. So the question that Subir is asking is, what exactly is the trigger point? What would make the system undergo a significant transformation so that we change the culture from a culture of obedience and blind acceptance to a culture of doubting, questioning, and disobedience? This is a very important question. My guess is that the trigger point for us is assessment. Now, we also have a culture of assessment. Why do students learn? Because they want to do well in the exams so that they can get, go for higher education so that they can make a good living. That's the ultimate. This is the purpose of education as students, parents, and everybody else sees it. Not the purpose of education as NEP points out. They are actually at loggerheads with each other. Now, we can change that culture if the assessment tests what NEP is looking for. And as far as I can see, I have been looking at the assessments. There are no assessment questions that actually test critical thinking. We have been talking about it, but I have not seen a single example of critical thinking questions in the assessment. There are no examples of critical thinking or inquiry in our textbooks. They have changed a great deal in terms of pedagogy, but the aims remain exactly the same. Let me give you some examples. This has to do with what Tara said about the 6-year-old, 7-year-old testing what the teacher said. We tell the students that the earth spins and revolves around the sun. And in fact, we say this in primary school. But the child's experience is that the earth is completely stationary. So we are asking the child to believe something that is preposterous. The child comes with the experience that the earth is completely stationary. Now we are telling the child that the earth spins and revolves around the sun. I have not seen a single textbook trying to provide the evidence and arguments for that position. Why should I believe that the earth spins? Why should I believe that the earth revolves around the sun? Why should I believe that the spin of the earth is tilted to the plane of revolution? The answer is missing in textbooks, and it is also missing in exams. Exams do not test the ability to answer the question, why should you believe X? Okay, these two things must be done. So exams should change, and the learning materials, textbooks should also change such that it is in that direction. Let me give you another example. We are told in textbooks that water is an element. Sorry, water is a compound, and air is a mixture. But according to the ancients, water is an element and air is also an element. So we have a responsibility to explain in textbooks the reasons for believing why air is a mixture, why water is a mixture. Not simply assert that this is so, because now it is assertion of one authority over another. We tell the students that all species on the earth, existing and extinct species on the earth, evolved from a unicellular ancestor. What are the reasons for believing that? This is not taken care of. So such issues, why should I believe such and such is true, is not addressed in examinations. That's not addressed in textbooks. And naturally, of course, teachers are not going to do that in the classroom, because teachers cannot afford to do something that is radically different from what is really required for doing well in the exams. So if those two things are changed, the first change to happen is changing the nature of assessment. And then to help learners learn what is needed for the exam, change the learning materials. That will also help the teachers to use those materials to help students what NEP requires them to do. So this is the action plan that I think would happen. This is not going to be easy. I'm not saying it is going to be trivial. This will take about 50 years, I think. But if we focus on those things and change the exams, change the learning materials, even though learning materials have been undergoing lots of changes, some of these things are completely missing in both assessment and in learning materials. That's my take on, not exactly answering your question, but kind of closely related to that question.
Yeah. A statement from NEP, which is somewhat related to what you're saying, is that they say that they look forward to curriculum content being reduced in each subject to its core essentials to make space for critical thinking. Now, that's interesting because they are equating reduction in the content with increase in critical thinking, almost as if it is sort of automatic. For a more reduction in critical in content will lead to automatically inquiry-based, discovery-based, discussion-based, analysis-based learning. That's what the NEP says. So questions will be encouraged. Now, these are indications that there is some thinking on this, but I don't know whether that is enough or that is articulated elsewhere. But there seem to be some sort of recognition for reducing the content. I mean, the way you are talking about the child questioning or child being made to accept that it is the earth which goes around the sun, and the earth is not stationary, earth is spinning at some phenomenal speed. Will that be, if that is to be dealt with, if the child is to be convinced that earth is actually moving in a rational way, then it might take a lot of time for the teacher. First, the teacher has to be equipped with what needs to be done to arrive at that, for the child to arrive at that conclusion. So reduction of content is something which is being talked about. But at the same time, it is being talked about in a way as if reduction of content will automatically lead to critical thinking. That is, they are just opposing that. So, all right. Okay. So,
can I just comment on
yeah.
that,
Yeah.
Sriram?
Yeah.
On the reduction of content.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know how they are planning to do that, but it's something that can be done very efficiently, very effectively, but it can also be done in a very haphazard way. So if it is the reduction of content is in order to make room for critical thinking,
right,
it has to be very carefully done such that whatever is retained, that material lends itself to, is amenable to critical thinking and exploring it in terms of critical thinking, right, in the classroom. So if that reduction is done carefully, yes, it will. But I don't get the sense that that has been thought about.
I want to pose a question to Subir on as a parallel track, which can probably bypass the system. Now, you have been sort of experimenting with this off and on, perhaps, is to actually see if a material which encourages a child to think critically can directly reach the child, some kind of a self-learning material, which can bypass the system totally. Now, is that can it work on large scale, that you don't now try and attempt a radical transformation of mindsets through the entire hierarchy? Instead, you try and the focus is on the student. Then you try and create kind of material which can be learned, which can be read by oneself. Some kind of numeracy and literacy is enough for the student to understand, and then start thinking critically. It's self-learning that student doesn't need. And given that information has been made available to us, everybody has a mobile device. acquiring sufficient information for the critical thinking process may not be difficult for the child. An earlier teacher was the repository of knowledge, no longer. So is that an option?
Yeah. So again, this is a little complicated, Uh, just to sort of connect with what Mohan was saying earlier, assessment uh, is a sensitive matter always. It's important, and it can potentially have that kind of impact. But look at what happened to that continuous comprehensive evaluation or continuous comprehensive assessment that we had. Ultimately, it had to be wound up, and it was never used. It was intended to be a pedagogical tool in the classroom, used in a different way. It got distorted, different versions came out of it, which were inappropriate, and ultimately ended up reinforcing what they were supposed to displace. So that is the kind of thing which often happens, and this is the kind of thing which can equally happen in the self-learning mode as well, Sriram. So what is currently going on is that a large number of efforts are being made to create these digital repositories. Diksha is one of them. There is National Resource, Open Resource Repository of Open Resource Materials, and so on. We have experimented with a number of things, from a small app to print material that children can have access to. So one of the things to remember always, which Kentaro Toyama talks about, which is that technology tends to amplify the tendencies you have. So if your tendency is not to think for yourself, but to follow, I often say that in India we have herd immunity to thinking. So if you have that kind of herd immunity to thinking, then you are likely to follow along the line and look at what's happening. People can access a lot of material, but what are they accessing? What are they doing with it? So that's a sobering sort of thought, that when you make material available in the wild, it is swamped by much else which is quite contrary to the objective that you have set out to do. On the other hand, the print material that we are talking of, because it does not lend itself to distraction, it does not allow a person to go into something else. You can't suddenly start seeing a video or something else in the middle. So it does many other things. So there we have found that children have been much more thoughtful. They have done a lot of things in a slow manner, explored a lot of things over a period of time, discussed, responded. It's a slow process, much slower than it would be with technology, but we have found it to work much better. We are also trying to explore this on a slightly wider scale. For example, in a large project that we did in UP, in about 8,500 schools. So that's a reasonable number, I would say, of schools. So there we basically drill down to something very simple, which is we ask teachers, can you please increase the number of questions that start with why, how, and if? If your children can't deal with this, basically they're not learning anything. And can you please at least ask once a day a question to which children will say something, but which you cannot predict. You cannot anticipate what they're going to say. So it can be as simple as what do you like to eat versus what do you do in a situation like this, but it should be not the usual information kind. And we found that just this ordinary little difference, it resulted in a few things. One, we found children become far more articulate than they used to be. So that's a very big shift. If you can't articulate, basically, especially you can't articulate with each other, you're not going to really start thinking a lot. Second, we found that when children became articulate, teachers found themselves becoming a little more responsive than they used to be. So, the point I'm making essentially is, firstly, that this is not something that you can just rely upon to happen. You have to nudge it along a certain direction for it to work out. Simply providing material on scale is not necessarily the way, but providing certain kind of frameworks which lead to certain likelihoods being more, that is the way to really go about it. And lastly, I just want to mention that one reason why technology has not made a disruption in education, everybody talks about disruptive forces. There's no disruption brought about, mainly because all the tech guys who, especially unfortunately, they studied at IIT or somewhere, and so they thought that education means knowing the kind of things they know and learning it in the way they learn. So as a result, what happens is technology repeats all the mistakes of education. That is to say, it encourages a one-way flow. It encourages the source of learning to be what is provided as content within the technology rather than the thinking done by the student. So because it replicates what goes on in education, it fails to make a difference at all. In order to do that, it has the most critical thing is find a question that matters to the child and then get out of the way. Because technology insists on giving the answer, it undoes itself. So that's the big shift that I would like to see.
Right. I think it is time for us to welcome questions from the audience.
Are the questions going to come here
Rashmi,
or somewhere else?
Rashmi, Aditi, are there questions?
Yes, we actually have quite a few. So shall I start asking them? And then Sriram, perhaps you can say address them to a panelist. So we have a question from Jitesh Seth. Um, how much action is NEP promising in working towards achieving that statement of purpose of education? Perhaps the statement we shared earlier.
Oh, okay. Which statement is he mentioning?
I think both the ones that Tara and Mohan projected, both of
Right.
those.
Yeah.
So,
Who would like to address it?
Yeah.
Subir, would you like? Yeah.
Subir would like to.
I'll take a go at it. So, one is that the NEP is a policy document. It is not an implementation document, really. The NEP, as I understand it, is about creating a castle in the air. It is not required to have a foundation yet. And in a way that is not bad, because otherwise if we were to say that no, give me the exact budget allocation, give me the exact administrative measures you are going to take, then we will refrain from saying aspirational things. Like this whole issue of critical thinking that we mentioned is hugely aspirational, given the background that we are coming from. So it's a radical thing that we have been able to say. Let's stop there, take a little breath, and then see what is the next small step that we can take in this 50-year journey. So yes, it is not promising a lot of things. It could afford to do a lot more, but let's wait for the plan of action for it to come out. At the moment, I am just willing to celebrate that somebody had the courage to say this.
Right. Yeah. So,
Okay. Yeah. So we have another question which says, don't we need a national teacher development policy to realize NEP?
I think it is necessary, but not yet. The question is, in which direction would we develop the teacher? What kind of resources should the teacher have? What kinds of capabilities teachers should have? And how do you remove the constraints that the teacher is operating on? For example, some of the things that I have seen that are hurdles for the teacher, even the well-intentioned teacher, is the idea, for example, covering the portion. Teachers don't have the time to do anything other than covering the portion. And teachers cannot afford to teach anything beyond what is needed for the exams. And finally, even if a teacher wants to get out of that system, for example, covering the portion problem and teaching to the exam, and the teacher is willing to, let's say, spend a couple of extra hours outside of the regular classroom to teach whoever wants to learn, the teacher doesn't have the learning resources to do that. So I would say, if those other things, other constraints are taken away and empowered, to repeat what I said earlier, if you have good learning materials and if you have good assessment, then the teacher can use those things. Teacher can say, look, kids, I want you to do well in the exams, and this is what the exams are testing. And then here is learning materials which will help you get there. The burden on the teachers is much less if you do that. So the first thing is empowering the teacher to do what we want them to do. Teacher comes only as the last bit in this complex system.
Yeah. Shriram, can I say something on this?
Yeah, please.
So very often we ask teachers, what do you need in order to teach better? So their a common response is freedom.
Yeah.
And every time a teacher tries to do something different, that teacher is restricted in many ways. As I said, nobody loves empowered teachers because they are dangerous to everybody. If you look at the situation as it exists right now, the constraints that Mohan mentioned are actually much bigger than what we realize. There is a situation which I call a design to fail situation, which is a teacher is asked to do something which is not possible to be done. He's asked to teach all the children the same thing at the same time with the same method and same material and get the same result. But every child is not only diverse, but what has happened is that after we increased enrollment dramatically, we now have children who never used to attend school ever. They're working children, children from certain communities, children with disabilities, migrant groups. In a city like Delhi, you have 11 languages inside the classroom because of migration with Punjabi and Odia next to each other. How do you teach this group? They can't come every day. The same group does not come every day, not in the morning or the afternoon. They don't, all of them know the language of the class. They can't get support at home. The best of teachers, I know of a couple of NCRT directors who try to teach in these schools and failed. So the point is, we are asking teachers to do something they can't do. So if you are looking at a policy in the first place, we must acknowledge what they really are required to do. We need to look at the issue of the design of the school and the design of learning per se. Only then it makes sense to look at what teachers are being asked to do. Next, we did make a new national curriculum framework for teacher education in 2009. And that, of course, needs to be evaluated. It's 10 years since that happened. But the key missing element is, though we have articulated a lot of things, we simply do not have the institutional wherewithal to deal with 6.7 million teachers. How do you work with that kind of group? That is something which has to be sorted out. So to that extent, I think whoever is asking this question about policy is not entirely wrong in looking at the thrust. Yes, there are many elements within NEP, including that of the standards. But the key is the enabling factor, which includes both the institution as well as what is these days being called supportive supervision, which is a person who has a certain background and experience and is able to work shoulder to shoulder with teachers occasionally to enable them to succeed in the class. So these are the kind of critical areas I would look at. Whether they are a policy or a plan, that's a different matter, but they are required at this time.
Right. Okay.
We have a question from Amol, who says, can critical thinking be cultivated simply by making it a part of formal education, which itself is doubtful, without an environment or overall culture which is conducive to it? Can I ask Tara to?
Can it be cultivated? Now, perhaps not to a very high degree, even if there is no culture outside. But at least if children are given examples, let's say from the 6th grade onwards, if they see examples of critical thinking, if they learn to question, if they learn to doubt and develop that mindset, then they'll carry it with them. And gradually, hopefully, if there is a generation of that kind, when they grow up, they will change the culture, right? It's going to be difficult. It's not easy at all. But with our own experience within Think, we've seen that it can happen in classrooms as long as we have the support of the, of the school system in that particular place. So yes, if you ask for a very general statement on that, that's not easy. But in small situations, yes, it is possible.
Yes.
Yeah.
To add to that, I think our experience has been that learners in class 6 and class 7 learn to think critically, learn to inquire fairly quickly, fairly easily. But then there is a problem of the teachers also learning. And in order for teachers to learn, they need the time. They don't have the time. Okay. And they are, as Subir said, they're discouraged actively from doing anything that is valuable. So we have this contradiction that students overtake teachers fairly quickly. And then teachers have problems in their students doing much better than them. And when the students start questioning the teachers, they become really uncomfortable because the teachers have not moved to the other paradigm of doubting and questioning themselves.
And if I can just add something to that, the flip side is that the earlier you start with this, the better the chances of their getting comfortable with it and being able to do it.
Yeah.
So this is a great point for the next question, which is addressed to Subir. Kiran asks, at what level of education can these changes be introduced? For example, will students in secondary school be able to adapt to changes if their early education was in the existing system? So you're on mute.
So, firstly, I mean, I would be very happy to begin uh, critical thinking in whatever form you might think appropriate, but from preschool onwards, there's absolutely no reason why a child cannot do this, and children do it. It's just that we don't realize it, or often it's discouraged. You're right. The issue does arise that if a child has been, let's say, socialized into not thinking, has been encouraged to sort of, or let's say the critical thinking area has been atrophied because of the excesses of the school system, then what do you do? So my experience is, and we have worked with a lot of adolescents in different places at different times, we have found that if encouraged in a gentle, supportive way, and if listened to, so that's the critical difference. Before children can start thinking, you really need to listen to them a lot. And I think one of the problems with teachers often is that the kind of questions we ask are more about the information or knowledge that they are expected to tell us. We rarely ask questions like, what do you feel when you are in a situation like this? I feel like this. So that's a conversational kind of question. I think that conversation is the difficult bit. Teachers are more comfortable saying, what do you think, or at the most, what do you know? But they certainly don't ask, what do you feel? And if we can't have those conversations, we are not going to get to that level of critical thinking. So yes, it is certainly possible, but it requires that, and very often I would say a school is essentially a set of conversations. That's my definition of a school. Can we have those conversations in the first place? If we are not having them, we don't even have a school. So it's possible to move towards that direction, and teachers themselves need that kind of compassionate, supportive interaction. Believe it or not, nobody has ever listened to teachers. And we expect them to love their students, but they have not experienced love of any kind from any of their trainers, teacher educators, or anybody. So if you want to make a breakthrough, I think that is the direction in which we can go. It certainly is possible. Doing it even on scale is possible. I just hope somebody lets us do it.
Thank you.
Aditi, can I just add something to that? Yeah, Sudhir said that it should start in preschool. And a good way, one thing that I've tried out, not in preschool, but in second grade, which is not very far from preschool, is telling a story that they're familiar with, but with certain differences. And you ask them what the differences are and why they are different and what is special about them. And they have, and that's really a conversation starter. So that kind of thing, if you can do right from preschool onwards, or give them pictures that are different, half done and fully done, and ask them what's the difference, and get them to start talking about it. Actually, that's a great way to start critical thinking at a very early age.
Sarah, that reminded me, because secondary was mentioned. I asked once a group of secondary students that, don't you think that the notion that slow and steady wins the race is a superstition? Because, in one imaginary story, one imaginary group of characters who actually don't speak in real life, they did something. Therefore, all of us believe that this should be done by everybody.
Yes.
Is it not superstition? And the kind of things that led to
absolutely.
Right.
Yes.
Or I can imagine this other story, the boy stood on the burning deck. Is that what you would really do?
Yeah. Actually, we have a question that connects well with this one. With
Aditi, I think that should be the last question. We are at 6 o'clock, unless there are so many more questions.
Oh, there are several more.
I'm willing to extend as long as you're willing to extend.
Okay, shall we, by consensus, shall we extend it by another 10 minutes or so?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
All right. We have a question that connects with Tara's response just now. Ram asks, in your experience, what factors have enabled children to think critically? And can you give some examples? So Tara already shared one, but if you have some more, I think those would be very enlightening.
Yeah. Well, the story I was talking about was that of the three little pigs. And in the different story, the new story, one of the pigs, the third pig, was a dentist, and it was a girl. And what she does is, when of course, the wolf huffs and puffs and so on comes down the chimney, she's there with her dental equipment, and pulls out his teeth so that he can't harm anyone, and then brings him down and heals him, treats him. So what the children said was, oh, there's a she in this story. That was one difference. Another was that the pigs were very kind. No, they saw that because they treated the wolf well. And they also thought of everybody else, because now the wolf couldn't harm anyone. So stories that if you want to teach them something, a twist to the story in that direction. Other things, well, another example that's worked is, you take seeds. What I did was take 3 seeds and three stones, all of roughly the same size, and divide the group up into this class into groups, small groups of 3 or 4, and give each one of them a bag with these seeds and stones, and tell them, just as you would divide up Lego blocks by color or by shape or whatever, divide these up the way you want, and then say why you've divided them up like that. They all did this and came back into the class. And the very first group, they had to group by group give their answers. The first group said, these are rocks and beads. Okay. And the second group said, no, it's not. It's not rocks and beads, it's stones and seeds. And then they had a discussion on why it's not rocks but stones, because rocks are huge and stones are little, and so on. They had a whole bunch of properties of rocks and stones, which all went up on the board. And then what about seeds and beads? Oh, beads are made by people. Seeds are natural things. They grow on plants. So that was their difference. And then I said, suppose I found a stone that was just like a seed. How would you tell the difference? And one of the children said, it has a little thing there on which, he said, there's a plant inside it. So we all said, no, we can't see the plant, so we can't talk about that. We can only talk about things that we can see. And so he said, it has this little thing there where it's attached to the plant. And if the piece doesn't have it, that means it's a stone. If it has it, it's a seed. Now, that was pretty good. I mean, that's how the conversation ended. But in the process, they had come up with so much this was a kind of classification, one of the tools of inquiry, and unearthing picking out the relevant properties of these entities. Now many variations of this exercise can be done with children. Yet another thing is, once they've started reading, which can happen at an early age, you get them to read a book and talk about the book, tell you the story of the book, or tell you what they liked about it. Ask them about what they are feeling. Do they feel sad? Why? What makes them sad? And so on. These are all, exercises that you can do. Plenty of them that you can do with children.
Yeah.
I just want to add, in case people missed that point, Tara is talking about second grade kids. And the same exercise that Tara did with the second grade kids about the seed versus stone, she did that with PhD students. The answer was exactly the same. The difficulties were exactly the same. No difference between second grade kids and PhD students.
There was just
The
one
only difference
difference.
was, yeah,
There was just one difference. The child in second grade, all the children actually, they said there is this thing where it attaches to the plant, and the PhD students said it has a germination point. That was it. That was the only difference between them.
So they stop growing after the class 2, is it?
Right.
Okay,
So
so
sorry, just a second. From Tara's point, statements and what Mona said, I make out that you need to have some provocation,
Yeah.
or whatever, stimulation, if you like.
Mm.
Something which is not complete in itself, but which allows the children to take it further. That's important. A willingness to explore with them, and of course, listening to children, and what you may call a kind of contingent or responsive conversation, which takes what they say and responds to that rather than what is in your own mind.
Yeah.
These are some of the classroom things that are critical. Yeah.
thank you for that. So be the next one could be for you, which is how to change the mindset and attitude of stakeholders. This is from Girish. Perhaps your experience could help you answer this question.
Yes, still struggling after 35 years. So the thing is, as I was mentioning earlier, we've done a lot of work on how children learn, but we haven't, as a country, looked sufficiently at how teachers learn. We are just beginning to talk about it when we mention performance indicators and standards in this policy. And we have not certainly looked at how communities, institutions like schools, institutions like SCRTs, and of course systems learn. But because of the experience that we have had, and we have failed grandly on scale, over the last 30 years on many things. We have trained like 5 lakh teachers and found it was all wrong. And now there is some learning about it. Some of those are that one, no teacher or and anybody else, I guess, exists to fulfill your dreams. They exist to fulfill their own dreams. So the moment we ask them, you have to do critical thinking because I'm telling you to do, it's just not going to happen. How do I create a situation where I co-create a vision? I can only do that by first getting a teacher to experience something different in my interaction with that person, to reflect upon it, and to see some seed or germs of it, or what they can do practically and comfortably in their own classrooms. If it seems like that, then the chances are that they will adopt it, they will adapt it, and they will actually start doing something. And when they do it, I need them to succeed if it has to take root. So I have to make sure that whatever they try in the classroom actually works. So this requires us to understand their situation as well as what we are doing, and to put it across not in the pure form that we have it in our mind, but in the kind of form that will be, let's say, ingestible within the situation. At the same time, we have to appreciate what stakeholders are bringing. So, for example, if a community member is coming, there's huge amounts of knowledge heritage and different kinds of thinking that they bring. A truck driver knows a lot about the geography of India, which my geography teacher doesn't know, and he can say a lot about why it is better to drive in a certain way in a certain situation. So that's the kind of thinking this person has done, but others haven't. How can I bring in the knowledge of every person, whether it is a storyteller or a farmer or a health worker or a lohar in my class? So if I can combine some of those things, I will begin to see certain changes happening. For any stakeholder to get involved, if they take no decision, they cannot get involved. That's the bottom line. So whatever I create, it has to have that innate adaptability, wherein the stakeholder takes it and adapts it to their situation, and without their consent, it is not going to. Consent is critical. Ownership is critical. Otherwise, it won't happen. So that's the bigger picture that I would say. How to do it with let's say administrative officers, how to do it with teachers, all those are more technical matters, but this is the broader frame. The broader frame is essentially a sympathetic, compassionate interaction where they experience something different. Then they're encouraged to reflect on what they experience, and then what do you think, what do you feel, and what do you think should happen in your situation? How can I support you in what you are doing? Is how you begin the change process, rather than coming in with a world-class thing which people won't understand or be able to deliver.
I would like to add to what Subir said about teachers existing to fulfill their dreams, not your dreams. We have conducted courses on inquiry and critical thinking for teachers, and a small subset of teachers do get excited. Now, here is what is interesting. The teachers get excited and they want to learn, but they want to learn in order to help their children learn. When we say, how about your students? They say, no, no, no. We want to devote attention to our children. They would do that for their children, but not for the students, because they know that for the students, what is important is getting marks for the exam. So this is one paradox. That is one category of teachers do this, only for their own children, not for somebody else's children. And to shift that attention from their children to other people's children is extremely hard. There is no reward for doing that in our system. The other is, there are teachers who are interested in their students and they treat their students as children. For those teachers, if they begin inquiry, let's say a 1-year course on inquiry, during the second week, they ask, how do you teach this to kids? Before they learn how to do it, they want to teach their kids how to become inquirers and critical thinkers. And when we say, please wait, you have to wait for at least 2 years before you can teach it to kids. They have no patience. They want to do it tomorrow. No, we are thinking about a cultural change, a kind of sea change that will take 50 years to happen. This is not going to happen, next week. So we have to have patience.
All right. Tara, would you like to add anything?
No, that's.
We have a lot of good questions, but I think we're running out of time now. So, Sriram,
You pick a certain number of questions and then we will end.
Okay. Shall I continue or?
Yeah, you can continue. I think, is there any objection to continuing for a little more time?
No, we are here. I'm here.
Yeah, we are
Okay.
fine. Yeah, fine.
Okay.
But
So,
for the people who would like to leave, I think we should make some announcement about next week. Not all the people would continue with us. They might drop off. So,
all right. Next week, same time, on next Saturday, we will have another session on critical thinking that will be more to do with schools and how school administrators see the critical thinking aspects in NEP and what is going on in their minds and what queries they have. And there will be a discussion around the implementation part at the ground level on how the challenges that they see in terms of taking it to the classroom and to the student learning. So join us for part 2 next week, next Saturday at 5 p.m.
I would also like to mention that some people have asked for a feedback link. So please send us your feedback on this email ID, which is contact@think.education, or you can contact us on various other social media platforms that we are available on. Right.
Can I also add that if there are questions that we will not be able to answer now, we might answer some of them in some written form if we can manage. I'm not promising. And maybe some kind of written document. This is not a promise. This is a wild idea. If that works, it is good.
All right.
Okay. So I think we can take one, since we're taking more questions, we have one from Pranav, which is related to Mo's last point. How does one target parents to start a conversation? More generally, can you talk about the role of parents in critical thinking?
The difficulty is that only a very small subset of parents are interested in helping their children do anything beyond doing well in the exam. The majority of parents that I have come across want their children to go to IIT so that they can get a good job. If there is anything that is not in that direction, the parents are not interested, number one. I'm talking about the majority of parents. A small number of parents are different. There are parents who ask us to teach their children. And our response has systematically been, we are not going to teach your children, we are not going to be private tutors, but we can help you to develop the ability to help other children, not simply your own children, but other people's children as well. If you promise to do that, we will help you develop that ability. Majority of parents are not interested in that. In fact, I have not seen a single parent who is willing to learn such that they will teach other people's children. So that being the case, I am not particularly hot on helping the parents. I'm sorry about that. Unless the parents are willing to teach other people's children, I don't think we can really afford to become private tutors for their children. That's the only solution that I can think of. So we would rather help those people who are willing to devote their time, the rest of their lives, to teach any children, not simply their own children. And there are more and more people coming up with that kind of mindset. We will make a difference to the world, not simply to their own children. So that's what we are willing to do.
Actually, can I just add something there? I don't believe that most parents are like that. And that is becoming clear now, especially in the COVID situation, where a lot of teaching has to be done at home. There's a lot of homeschooling that needs to happen, and it is happening, right? Probably without any help, without any sustained help, but it is happening. And if there is some kind of a program for parents such that they can teach their children, it would certainly be a good idea.
I think, of course, it is a good idea, but have you seen parents yet who are willing to learn, to spend at least a year to learn to develop critical thinking abilities so that they will teach other people's children? I have not seen them yet, but I'm pretty sure they exist somewhere in the world, somewhere in India. But I am saying in my sample, I have not found a single one.
So,
Subir, go ahead.
That people don't see, people don't know perhaps that critical thinking is something that requires years to develop, and maybe even the policymakers put it in without realizing how much work it requires. But what's happening right now, and Tara pointed at it. See, we have had for the last 2-3 centuries a kind of outsourcing model of schooling. So parents outsource their children's welfare and education, but before that, families basically educated children as much at home as outside, and even now in hunting gathering communities, actually it is communities who educate their children on whatever aspects of life that are relevant for that community, and some of their pedagogies are remarkably contemporary. But what's happening right now, homeschooling is one part of it, but in many rural areas, in small town places, for example, in Karnataka, there are at least 100 villages where teachers have started community schools in a community space, bringing in a rain gauge to measure the rain. And if parents are willingly participating, panchayats are supporting them. We can see this kind of phenomenon in certain other places. For example, in Varanasi area where our team works, we have found parents to become a little more concerned and willing to do a lot of things. In Gujarat, when we worked on getting communities to share their knowledge, for example, I mentioned to you about how an ironsmith came and talked about how he separates impurities from metals, which is fairly high degree of chemistry. Now, this is obviously nowhere near your critical thinking. The point I'm making is that certainly not in middle class parents who pay a lot of money to send their children, but in communities other than that, this kind of thing may not be the case. Children do grow up with many people looking after them. There are many areas in India where there are kind of, you can say, it's like a community raising of a child is still practiced. We spent a lot of time in Odisha, for example, where a child just walks into any home and that is the child's home. So it's a little different, and if we can tap on those, I am hopeful that those communities will one day go well ahead of that little thin stream of middle class people who think they are the main.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's the difference between the middle class and upper class versus the lower income group. Lower income group in rural areas are actually much more capable than, I agree.
So it's good to hear that this is happening.
Yeah.
One minor point is that in the middle class, as I agree with you in the sense, if you observe middle class parents in school atmosphere, they are not willing to take responsibility for any other child. I'll take responsibility for my child's behavior. So if some other child does something which is unacceptable, and no adult is willing to actually say that, look, you're not doing it right, but so the collective adult responsibility has diminished as a concept among the middle class people, and probably it exists elsewhere. So that is something that middle class and upper class should learn from other communities.
Okay. Sriram, I'll hand it over to you now, and perhaps we can get some final comments from each of the panelists.
Yeah, final comments from the panelists, then I will close.
Well, nothing from me. We've said, I think.
Yeah, nothing from me either.
All right, I think we have said all that. Subir, would you like to say something?
Just that it was a learning experience.
Yeah.
Right.
Especially from Subir, yes.
Yeah, otherwise you don't get a chance to interact with Subir. So this is a good opportunity.
Right.
I really learned a lot about critical thinking as well. And I think, we need to see this in what I will call a change perspective. Unfortunately, the education world, and I suppose the development world, is full of what is bandied about as theory of change. Theory of change is essentially just a logical framework in which you put things which are used by donors. It is based on what used to be called the logical framework, log frame, which I often used to call frog lame, mainly because it did not take into account the ground realities. All the assumptions it was based on were inappropriate. For example, you assume that children will spend 800 hours in a year, but they spend 250. So all your assumptions don't actually work out. So why I'm mentioning all that is because in a sense, policies are the nice feel-good part of thinking about change. It's like when you write in your to-do list, you fill it up with lots of things and you feel very happy. I've got a long to-do list. That's just the beginning. It's like a New Year resolution. And so we need to look at it as a change process. And by which I mean, we need to theorize about how change will happen in families, in teachers, in schools, in systems. So it's not merely about a plan and implementation. It is about getting the theory of change, the genuine theory of change, right. If we can't see it, and that's where I really think the history of what has happened in India or similar situations, whenever change has been sought to be achieved, what has worked and what has not worked, especially what has not worked, and how can we be smarter than we used to be 20 years ago. I would really love that we make new mistakes as a country, which we are not doing. We are making the same mistakes again and again for 35 times. That's not okay. We need to move on, discover it in different ways, and then maybe a few years down the line, we will have found a path. So that's the hope that I have. And thanks everyone for listening to me.
All right. Yeah.
Thank you, Subir. Thank you. And thanks, Sriram.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll leave you with one quote from one line from Rabindranath Tagore's Where the Mind is Without Fear. There is one line which says, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit. That line is something for us to reflect on. Thank you all so much for joining this evening, and thank you all for your time. I hope you gained a little bit from this conversations. And if you have questions, as Aditi said, write to those mail IDs and we may be able to respond. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.